Hello and welcome to this audio recording. My name is Mike Jenkins and joining me today is author Philip Pegler, and we're here to spend some time reflecting on readings from his book, Quiet Courage of the Inner Light. Hello Philip, welcome.
Hello Mike, nice to be with you.
Thank you for joining me. So we're going to talk today about two specific chapters in your book. And they're of a particular time and experience in your early life. Would you like to just tell us a bit about that? I know you've written some reflections today about those experiences. So if you just introduce us.
I would say in introduction, I was training to be a nurse up in Scotland in the Highlands, and it was a comprehensive 3-year course which involved working on psychiatric wards as well as what they used to call mental deficiency and general nursing.
And I was in the 1970s, was it?
This was actually 1974.
Right.
Okay. And prior to embarking upon a nursing career, I'd worked as a newspaper reporter. So I had a prior career before changing direction, and I wanted to work in the caring professions.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for wanting to talk about these issues, the issue of mental health actually, is because I feel that spiritual practice is not to be taken lightly. It is deep acting and transformative, but progress for people is often uneven, by no means straightforward. For a while, for some people, mental disturbances can take place, and these disturbances can carry on over a considerable period of time. Why is this? This is because when we attempt to work within, we effectively disrupt the status quo of our inward consciousness, which has, of course, been formed by our upbringing, by our inheritance, and by subsequent experience. I want to talk about this with particular care because this kind of mental breakdown happened to me, and I passed through the dark tunnel which it represents, and I may be able to help other seekers on the spiritual path navigate the sort of problems that I had to navigate as a young man.
That's really valuable, I think, not only to people who perhaps are experiencing some of these mental, emotional disturbances, as a result of or during meditative inquiry or spiritual practice, but also in general. I think as we hear the readings, you're going to read for us in a moment from those two chapters, it's very clear, isn't it, that at the moment in the current society that we're in, this period of history, there has been a change in attitudes to mental health. And interestingly, as you know, we've spoken about this before, but I also experienced very similar periods of mental ill health in my 20s, and also had to spend time on a psychiatric ward just once. But similar to you, I have found that there have been times in spiritual practice where there's been a deep grounding and support for those mental, emotional disturbances through meditation or spiritual practice. But equally, there have been times when that opening to our sort of free, vast consciousness can bring up a great many unresolved elements and pain and experiences in the body and mind. So I think that's going to be very valuable to lots of people.
Thank you. I concur with everything you've said. Okay.
So should we have the reading then? So this is Philip's going to read for us from a chapter in his book, and it's the first chapter we're reading from is chapter 20, and it's A World Behind Walls.
Some impressions are so deeply etched in memory that they never fade, and there is frequently a resonant quality to retained images such as these, which later tend to serve as significant reference points upon our interior journey on the path of living. That observation certainly holds good regarding my own recollections of several memorable weeks when I helped care for a group of patients with mental health issues in a long-stay psychiatric ward. Whenever I bring to my mind those spells of duty at the vast grey Scottish hospital where I underwent training as a psychiatric nurse, what is immediately uppermost for me is the strong sense of confinement I experienced. The large bare ward always seemed gloomy and dark on those winter days in the Highlands long ago. The male patients either sat around the rooms on benches, listless and depressed, or they paced up and down anxiously like trapped animals in a cage. In the meantime, members of staff came and went through the main door, to be kept locked at all other times. As we looked to the men's basic needs during our shift, we were their appointed keepers, and our time on duty, with little to do for hours on end, hung heavily on our hands. As our own boredom grew, our patients, meanwhile, just moved around uneasily, and they had little to do except to wait for the next meal, which was everything for them. Our charges seemed for the most part forsaken souls, morose or withdrawn, speaking in riddles or mumbling gibberish as they frequently did. Meaningful communication with them seemed an impossibility, and yet the spark of life within them glowed still, flickering up now and then in surprising moments of clarity or humor. Caring for them could have been a dour and unrewarding task, to say the least, and yet curiously, I felt privileged to be entrusted with an unusual job like that, which seemed to belong to a bygone age of grim institutions or workhouses for the destitute from altogether another century. There I was, a keen young man from a privileged background who had never known lack, but nevertheless, somehow, there I was, a caretaker for sorry inmates in a somber space where the sun hardly ever shone. The windows loomed large in that old hospital building, and it hardly mattered what size they were, for they overlooked an outer scene which had faded from memory forever for these long-term patients with virtually no prospect of release. It was a forsaken place for sure, but in hindsight, I can see there were cogent reasons for having been drawn to this kind of caring work. My eldest brother had suffered severe physical trauma during his difficult birth, and he grew up with cognitive disabilities. He was unable to cope with normal schooling and before long required permanent institutional care in a psychiatric hospital, much the same as the one where I was presently training. Having grown up alongside a close relative with mental health issues, it was hardly surprising then that I had developed a natural affinity for unfortunate people in a similar plight to my own brother. I often wondered accordingly how one could bring a quality of joy into the lives of these forgotten men in Scotland. The trouble was, the inactivity and lack of light in their ward soon weighed me down, so that before long a feeling of weary impotence came up, even after one had only been shut in with the patients for a short while. Looking after them properly was evidently far more demanding than one might think at first sight. My clear wish to invoke the light in this most inhospitable of settings was admirable enough, and bearing in mind my family background too, suggested I had a clear vocation to care for the unfortunate and dispossessed. But what I did not fully realize then was that the wish to descend into this pit of darkness also brought with it an obligation to encounter the forces of disorder and instability within myself. And the task I was so eager to accept in my inexperience would prove to be by no means a momentary one either, but a lifelong commitment to unearth deeply hidden inner truths. From an esoteric perspective, it represented nothing less than the profound alchemy of inward transformation by which one seeks to turn the dross of ignorance into the shining gold of illumination. Glowing language like that was most certainly out of place in a psychiatric hospital 40 years ago. Yet even so, the profound facts of psychoanalysis cannot be denied so easily. In symbolic terms, you could say that the time had come now for me to plunge into the deep and murky waters of the unconscious mind, whether I liked it or not. This would prove to be that decisive moment when the ordered routine of my days crumbled without warning and my life fell apart. It was the critical moment when an unwelcome vulnerability from the past caught up with me in no uncertain terms. At such a significant juncture in my chosen career, it was a crisis that I could have done well without. But in the end, it turned out to be an important rite of passage and something unpleasant that I no longer need to sweep under the carpet. It is a hard truth, but a salutary one nonetheless. We do not always realize what is best for us in the long run. Ironically, it is the most unfortunate events in life that often prove to be the most valuable and by far the best means of bringing this stern message home to us.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely reading. It's an incredibly impactful and stark story and powerful that you're telling there. We're going to go on later in the second part of this audio recording. There'll be two parts. And in part two, we're going to hear what happened next, as it were. But I wonder if you could just share with us a little bit about what you thought perhaps was going on in the sense of the journey into your own sort of darkness. It's interesting to me that from the reading that you gave and from the understanding that I've got from that, I'm getting the sense that in your own openness to the experience of the patients that you were caring for, there was an opening, and you talk about a descending into your own kind of dark place within that you weren't expecting, that was unexpected. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that now, all these years later.
Well, at the time, I was absorbing the atmosphere of the institutional long-term ward. My own disturbances hadn't, come out at that point. That was the irony of it. They came out a few months later, actually, while I was still, undergoing the spell of the period of time when we were designated to work in the psychiatric hospital. When I was actually with the long-term patients, my life was calm and ordered enough. The breakdown hadn't occurred. It was to occur a few weeks down the road, following I'd had a love affair with another student on the course, and she had terminated that relationship. And I think I was under a lot of stress with the nursing studies. And then you'll hear in the second chapter how actually my own disturbances came and what transpired from that. But while I was actually in the long-term ward, no, I simply had this sense of privilege to be in such an extraordinary setting, having been brought up in the south of England in very favorable circumstances, and this was like going back into another century. It was it was like a deja vu experience, like having lived at another time.
I'm sure. And that sense of confinement that you spoke about, and even the title of the chapter, A World Behind Walls, many of us at the moment, at this present time in the health crisis with the coronavirus, many of us are confined to our homes and confined within walls with just an hour or two a day of allowance to go outside to exercise. So
yeah, this is absolutely true. But the atmosphere of the ward, it was palpable. It was the walls that confined us there were of a different order
Mm,
from the majority of settings which, our friends and neighbors are obliged to be confined within. This
mm,
was of a different order, and it carried a weight, a dark weight, all of its own.
It does resonate with my own experiences of a psychiatric ward. The sort of atmosphere, the air is sort of thick with the kind of suffering, really, of all the various patients. I remember that very well. It was a sort of real, it's hard to describe, but an intense sort of just atmosphere of an energetic potency to
There's a kind of density there,
Mm,
a
mm,
density. There's, it's indescribable, actually, if
mm.
you haven't
No,
if
and
you haven't
indeed,
gone through that.
and hopefully most people haven't. I'm sure some will have done.
Yeah,
Just one last thing, and then I think we'll conclude this part of the audio and come back another time to record the second section. But I think it's quite common knowledge in amongst the psychiatric community that professionals in that line of work, either doctors, psychiatrists themselves, or nurses and carers, uh, um, have frequently suffered their own mental collapse and mental breakdown. Partly, I think it's understood in proximity to the intense mental, emotional emittance of the suffering from those around them. And I think those institutions are naturally, because of the man-made structure of them and the deliberate confinement of people in a certain structure, I think that can give rise to a kind of malaise that can affect other people.
you feel trapped, and you also feel a sense of hopelessness, and there
Mm,
is a deep fear, kind of primeval fear, primitive fear, but you're never going to get out.
mm,
Even though your common sense, your rational sense knows that you probably will get out, the actual primordial primitive feeling,
mm.
you'll never get out. This is the sense of confinement.
Yes, and often, of course, the confusion about what's actually wrong with one, and
Yes,
then
I
research
think I would say
can
one
always.
more thing there is there is a feeling, certainly in my case, I was not being understood. I
Mm,
was not being understood. My entire spiritual search was misunderstood. What was happening to me, I didn't feel anybody at that time. Maybe it would be very different now, but I
mm,
didn't really feel that anybody had any empathy. So I felt abandoned, actually.
yes, yes. It's incredibly powerful, Philip, and thank you so much for reading that chapter from the book. Um, we'll return in part two to reflect further on the second reading, which is the chapter that follows directly on from this one. And for anyone who's listening, we're reading and reflecting on chapters from Philip Pegler's book, The Quiet Courage of the Inner Light. And the subtitle is Finding Faith and Fortitude in an Age of Anxiety. So thank you, Philip, for joining me, and we'll return again to read the next chapter.
I look forward to that. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.